We're gonna share some mics here while we wait for Jim. What I wanted to do with this panel, we'll do an introduction. Well, Jim's here. Thank you for joining us. What I wanted to do with this panel is talk about this communications infrastructure providers. It's a term that the analyst community is using to describe these newer types of emerging carriers, basically. So if I take a look back at what happened in the late 90s after deregulation, they called them emerging carriers. These were companies that were building out fiber networks. You saw a lot about that earlier in Jack's presentation. You had Wilcon out there and other network operators, Quest, and they've all been merged into various different companies at this time. And now we have a different emerging type of carrier coming out. And this new type of emerging carrier takes into consideration the entire infrastructure of what it takes to provide a service to a customer. And that entire infrastructure is not just fiber, but it's also the towers, and it's also the antennas, and it's everything else in between. And each of those elements and pieces aren't necessarily provided by one of these single companies, but they all together make up what the communication infrastructure provider market is all about. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today with this esteemed panel. And I do appreciate you guys all being here today. So I do have a few questions here, and I'm going to ask each one of you this question, and I'm going to hand this mic over to you first once I'm done. But how has the proliferation of mobility affected the way you look at your business?
Thanks, by the way, thanks for the intro. It is our business, right? We're super excited about it. That's why we're in this space, because we assume that this is going to happen, and it's going to continue to happen as long as people keep using their devices the way they're using them. It bodes great for us as a company and as an industry as well. So our job is to just be as prepared as we can. We're fairly confident that barring any huge change in physics, people are going to need places to put their equipment to provide this infrastructure, and that's our business.
Yeah, let me start with who we are. Extenet Systems, have been around since 2002, and we started out as a completely traditional DAS provider in the outdoor space. 2007 came about, and the indoor space started because of the iPhone, right? And we were a traditional DAS provider through that point. About 2013, 14, we recognized that the industry's shifting just like it is today, and therefore, everything going on in the enterprise space, and we actually changed our, the name of our part of the company from an indoor business unit to a enterprise solutions group. And that's because we think of it as converged communications, and whether it's Jim's guys doing stuff on the roof, or it's us with some sort of DAS, whether it's small cell or something else, or it's ultimately just a fiber backbone that we're doing, so that we're doing the comm infrastructure piece of it, so that whatever needs to be connected to that infrastructure can be. And I say that in a way that tenants are asking for the gamut. Building owners need to provide building management systems across the spectrum. Call it elevators, digital signage, public safety, two-way radios, whatever else. That all needs to ride on infrastructure. And if you've been in this space for a while, you recognize that commercial real estate owners have rented space. Then they've stovepiped connecting things to that space based on the needs of the day, the pain point of the day. So we're trying to take an approach that provides solutions that are what we call converged communication infrastructure, meaning how do you put this all together and save yourself some dollars and make some money in the end. So that's kind of where we are right now.
Hi. Hello. So my name is Enzo, and it's way up. Let me try yours here. That's better. So I think converge is the right word. Cross River, I started this business in 2011 to build a fiber optic network throughout the state of New Jersey that was robust to service enterprise businesses, carriers. And at the time, we thought about wireless mobility. It didn't have this sort of persona, this all-encompassing aggregation of everywhere, anywhere, and how fast. And so we see this convergence happening today, and we've morphed into what was once a fiber optic provider to a communications infrastructure provider, and this is all converging together. It's an exciting time, and when I think about proliferation, I specifically think about how we architect our networks to accommodate. And you know, I feel like we've been talking about this for a while, but legacy fiber optic networks are not capable of accommodating all of this aggregation and access. And so we think about capacity, we think about coverage. So when we think about that, we think about architecting a network that can support it. So that network needs to have multiple access points every couple hundred feet as opposed to every few thousand feet. It needs to be, a higher count fiber system that aggregates back to multiple edge points for regeneration and signal transferring. So it's a different type of architecture that I think, that's the recurring theme that you're going to hear about amongst all of us today. And this word convergence is actually happening. And so we're excited to be part of that.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm Eric Mercer. I'm with Transit Wireless. And at Transit Wireless, we have built a wireless infrastructure throughout the New York City subway system. And it started out just as a few stations, which grew to the full network over time. So when we were building from the initial stages of it, you had to plan your design and how that would go forward. And a lot has changed from when we started the business to where we are today. And as with the evolution of the project has grown, and we finished completion of all 282 stations for underground service, we have had to see evolutions of the industry. So when you started building an infrastructure way back when, which the project started, we started building the infrastructure in 2011, starting on our first stations. At that point, you're looking at what spectrum you're going to deploy and how you're going to deploy it and what the mobility needs to provide, provisions of the network need to be, and how that needs to be designed for. Well, the evolution of it has put you in a position where you have to constantly grow and constantly expand. And things that you didn't think of in the very beginning have now, extended to today. So from a mobility perspective and from a converged network perspective, in addition to just supplying an infrastructure for the 4 major wireless carriers, you have to think about Wi-Fi solutions. You have to think about IoT. We went into the project believing that we're supporting the 4 wireless carriers, and that was an onerous project to begin with, and how to get that off the ground and get that infrastructure in place. But as we've grown, we've seen the need for the end real estate owner, meaning the MTA, on what services we can provide to them. So from that standpoint, we had to have the infrastructure support their needs. So the mobility infrastructure that you think about when you first begin a project is something that is a constantly evolving process, getting further and further and closer to the edge. So Transit Wireless, as we've grown, is in a position that you build the infrastructure from the beginning with the thought process to expand throughout.
So it's interesting because every single one of you talked about the pivot, right, and the transition and having to be flexible. And, you started off as one thing, but realized that the world needs something else and something different. And you've, as businesses, accommodated that. Now, if you think about large businesses out there, how many large businesses do you know can pivot in like a year? Raise your hand. It's nearly impossible to pivot a business model. And when I spoke earlier, I talked about this 4th industrial revolution and talk about what we have to do to be able to meet the needs of where we don't even know where we're going in 5 years or 10 years from now. We couldn't have pretended to be where we were, 5 years ago. We had no idea where we would be today. And so when we take into consideration these businesses out there that we're serving, whether they are, an enterprise like the MTA or a building owner operator or a large enterprise company with campuses throughout the world, what are their biggest challenges that they're facing? And so Bill, maybe we start with you on that. from the perspective of the enterprise businesses, right? Because your company now is focused on that enterprise. What are their largest challenges in how they are adapting to this fourth industrial revolution?
I'd tell you not very well, right? There's lots of education that needs to go on. It's a shame, like when we always ask the audience, how many of you are real estate providers? Most of us are vendors or in our industry trying to, learn some things to help our customers, because the customers aren't here in this room. It's a shame they're not in this room, right? Because they need to kind of hear the challenges we're going through. So I think first off, it's definitional. So like you have as a title here, communication infrastructure providers. Extenet considers ourselves a comm infrastructure provider. We're providing infrastructure in multiple ways. Bad mic? Bad mic, bad mic. We consider ourselves a communication infrastructure provider because we're providing that to our enterprise customers, building owners, enterprise clients, and the wireless service providers. So there's a few other definitions that we need to make sure. There's communication service providers and there's wireless service providers. You can decide whether wireless service providers falls under the big umbrella of comm service provider or the other way around, right? But it's important for you when you talk to your real estate owners or your enterprise customers that they understand what you're talking about, first off. So when we say communication service providers, we mean anything that can connect to the network, and that includes the wireless service provider. So in the past, 3-4 years ago, when I was going to them, I was only talking about AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, right? That's all I was talking to them about. That was a wireless service provider. Now I'm talking about L3Com. I'm talking about Cogent. I'm talking about AT&T Wired. I'm talking about Verizon Wired. I'm talking about Light Tower. I'm talking about what do you need? What kind of circuit do you need? What's the tenant asking for? Is he asking for a terabyte of capability? Is he a financial customer, JP Morgan Chase, who won't even allow much of its stuff to be combined with other because of the security implications? So I think that the challenge is this education piece of one, those definitions, making sure they're clear when you talk to a customer. And then as we heard this morning, the real estate owner itself cares about net operating income, cap rate, things like that. So we've got to apply it in that way for them to make sure they're getting what they want. Even if this expense they're going to do with us is a outward expense, and they're not collecting revenue from us, they're doing it because they're going to get better tenants. They want the Googles, the Yelps, the WeWorks, whatever, to rent the space in their building because it's the millennials with a lot of high-tech gadgets and they want them to come. If we don't do our job because the owner hasn't thought far enough ahead and defined this well, and we help them with a business plan to do that, then they just rent space. And the tenant has to fend for himself. And therefore, they're going to go to a place that has the technology, et cetera. So I think that's the important key here is there's lots of education that needs to go on. The definitions of infrastructure providers and solution providers is key for us to be able to educate the world on. And look, we're connecting now with, you guys, Cross River, with, Victoria over there. I'm going to buy her company, I told her, right, because we need it, right? Because fiber everywhere is key to provide the pipe to get to all this capability that our customer, enterprise-wise and outdoor-wise, needs.
No, I definitely agree with you that there's an education aspect of this, and that's the hardest part of what we are all doing. Clearly, this program today is about trying to help get the education not only amongst ourselves, but having us talk on the same page about getting these messages in front of the enterprise. And I know, Eric, you must have some challenges with the same, right? How are enterprises responding to transit?
Well, it's a conversation that has to be a continuous conversation, right? You can't just have that conversation go away because it's evolving. And from an enterprise perspective, at the end of the day, they need to understand that our industry, the mobility industry, while there is a huge need for services and the amount of services are ever expanding, at the same time, the wireless carriers who are providing the services and for a long time footing the bill for all of the infrastructure that was going out the door, they're getting a crunch from a standpoint that they're supposed to provide all this connectivity, yet everybody wants it at a cheaper rate. You don't want to pay more for your services, right? You want to keep that fixed, but you want to make sure you stream all your Netflix shows and catch up on everything as wherever you are. So, and the mobile workforce, right? Everyone is out there and saying, okay, well, I need to be connected wherever I am. Yet, while all that infrastructure needs to be in place, who's going to pay for it? Because at the end of the day, you know, we don't live in a society where it just miraculously the infrastructure gets built. So in the conversation, we have a conversation with our enterprise being the MTA, is that for the services that they want, we got to understand that, listen, while the carriers have paid for a great deal of the infrastructure and they're providing that service and that's getting out there, you can't just sit back and say, well, you're the only game in town. You have to come to me, and therefore I'm going to sit here and make sure that people provide infrastructure into my environment without me having to go into my pocketbook and saying, hey, I might need to fund some of this because the services are so required.
So, can I add to that? I see that a lot. I think you're spot on. I work with a ton of commercial real estate owners. They don't like to pay for anything, period, ever. But, as you guys have all mentioned, as soon as their tenants demand it, they will start to pay for it, right? So it's almost transitioning to a utility in some sense. You know, I mean, I remember in hotels you always paid for internet. You don't pay for internet in hotels anymore. So it's always difficult to get people to spend money. You know, we own a lot of towers, so if we have a new entrant into our space, like Dish Networks, we're super flexible in the beginning as they test their network and try and roll it out. Convincing some of our real estate owners to be as flexible is challenging, even though they may benefit from it down the road. So I think we're in this sort of transitionary phase from good to have to need to have.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we do at Transit Wireless, and I think all of the companies that we represent do, is that from this converged network standpoint, is that no one entity can fund the infrastructure that's required in order for all the services to take place. So you don't have everybody building their own separate networks. You need entities like ourselves to come in and say, okay, we can build a converged network. We can support these various services, and having the boots on the ground and the knowledge and the ability to build a network that supports multiple facets of need is a requirement in a lot of these spaces.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you guys touched upon a couple of the challenges, right? A lot of the challenges we face are driven by the carriers themselves from a couple of different angles, right? We take a look at the carriers. They initially provided a lot of the funding to enable this infrastructure to happen, and they pulled back on that funding. So that left a lot of opportunity out there of who is going to fund that. The building owner operators didn't want to fund that, but the tenants need that. So, right, so we have this cycle. And now we have even other things affecting these carriers. Everybody, I'm sure, is reading up on how there's a big reversal in the whole net neutrality rules and how that is affecting the open networking and accessibility to the fiber networks, and how they all don't want that to happen anymore. They want everything to be privatized again. And so that leads us into, you know, my next question, actually, which is about this carriers, right? What is it about them and their unwillingness to help with the densification that's taking place in the market? We need them, but yet there's also companies, i.e. right here, right next to me, who have to go out and do it yourselves, because if they're not doing it for you, you have to do it. So what are the challenges that you're seeing, maybe Enzo, in the carrier and from the carriers that way?
I mean, I think when I think about these challenges, I think about carriers, I think about government, and I think about society. But let's talk about carriers for a moment. I think they have to come to the conclusion that this is, we're playing in a space that's not just black and white anymore, and you have to be creative and innovative with solutions, specifically siting solutions. When you think about I am competitive with so-and-so, but, and my solution is the only one and encompassing one. You have to think outside the box a bit. And so I think the carriers have to be more flexible with grabbing what's available to them as opposed to being so rigid in their approach. And so I think that it starts with them. I think it starts there. I think, government has to be more flexible in that they have to loosen up the reins in the approval process and making it easier for carriers to do their deployments and what have you. And again, it goes back to the three things that are most important here. It's siting, it's connectivity, and power. You have all of these utilities that have to come together to make the solution work. And so government sort of has their hands in it. In New Jersey, for example, there's 550 plus municipalities. Everyone has their opinion on, the evolution of small cell and building out ODAS. And, they're just kind of not quite sure how to go ahead and say, you got the green light to do it. So they have to be educated. And that's, that has a lot to do with the carrier educating, but getting society comfortable with it. The society has to get comfortable with, hey, we want, a more efficient way of doing things, quality of life. It's going to get better with, this convenience factor of having all of these things tied at the hips and working, smoothly and efficiently. So I think there's a few different components, but it certainly starts with the carriers who want to do the deployments.
I see Jim smiling here. I'm sure that there's something about Vertical Bridge's view of the carriers and what you're doing. Married that with the municipalities, who you mentioned, and the government, the lack of education. Another little secret of mine is that I was an elected official in my local village. I served 2 terms, and it was an enlightening opportunity because as much as I know about nothing, they know a lot more about nothing. And imagine going in to present to these municipalities, and if anybody here from a municipality? I hope I'm not offending you, but we're here to help to try to educate, and I always appreciated when people came in to give me that opportunity to learn about what they're doing and why it was important. And unfortunately, there are so many things tugging at this that this becomes the lowest opportunity for them. There's cost to it. It's complex. There's regulation around it. There's carriers involved. There's too many players that it becomes unwieldy to manage. And I'm sure you run into this all the time. I know Extenet does for sure.
Yeah, we do, and there's a lot of special interests, right? So everybody's got their own bent on why somebody should or shouldn't do things, and they don't align necessarily at all. So we see it, quite a lot. The carriers are our biggest tenants by far. So they can certainly be difficult sometimes. I think they underestimated how difficult it would be to do a small cell site compared to a macro site. So I think they're finding a lot of it is the same amount of work with a lot less dollars involved at the end of the day, which is why you're seeing all these pushes, legislative issues, trying to force small cell down the municipalities' throat, which a lot of municipalities are fighting back pretty hard because they can build a tower any place they want, including in your front yard. So I get both sides of the equation. It needs to be easier for the carriers, but municipalities should have a say in it as well. Again, I keep going back to at what point is this stuff a utility, right? And then how do we treat that like we do treat our utilities? Maybe we never do, but. Yeah.
I definitely know Bill's got something to add here.
Well, look, my team is primarily involved with the real estate owner, right? And a lot of the reason we're at the real estate owner is because of the difficulty with the municipalities. So Extenet has an entire team that we call external relations that deals with what Jim has to deal with siting issues and all the things you deal with. I have now opened my aperture in the enterprise space where in the past I would just be talking about the indoor space, helping the tenants with their issues. I'm also trying to put into our real estate agreements, what can we use the exterior of your building? And I'll give you an example. In Denver, it was fairly difficult for the carriers to do some things there with either rooftop or cell towers. And they came to us with the buildings we had already built with indoor DAS there and said, would you think the real estate owner would accept an exterior antenna? because it would be easier for us to go make an amendment to our agreement with that real estate owner and then do a camouflaged antenna on the outside of their building and shoot down the street. And so we did a few of those. So that's what's happened, is the pain points are so bad with municipalities and the other things that even the carriers are saying, can you get other rights other than indoor rights when you sign your agreements? And so, we try to do that because, again, it's about revenue for both the real estate owner and for us, right? We're trying to figure out ways to pay for things in a better way. And if there's not enough capital, which is the big part of your first question, is carriers, and carrier definition, I'm assuming you're only talking the 4, right? That's the definition versus carriers, comm service providers. But for those 4, they're just capital constrained, let's be honest, okay? I mean, they spent billions on their RF spectrum. They had a great ride from 07 to about 15 when everybody was buying new plans and all that stuff. That's all leveled off. What's happening now, we're turning in one plan for another and we're buying a new phone. But it's not going like rocket like it did. Yet they need to densify, and so the capital, they can't do it all. So they're pushing on us for lower prices. They want 10 buildings for the price of what we used to do 1. And so now we have to get revenue from other sources in order to build that network. So that's why we're in the comm infrastructure business now. It's a supply-demand economics decision. Otherwise, we wouldn't be building anything. We have to get revenue from other places on that building, not just the wireless service providers. So that's why we're there. And if we don't do the converge thing, we'll never get this done because there's not enough capital to do it all.
So when we talk about the enterprise, what is it that they are the problem that they're trying to solve? Is it the problem of communications between other parts of their business? Is it a problem of getting access to the cloud? I mean, what is it they're trying to solve with this infrastructure? Is it being able to access anything, anywhere, anytime? There's a lot that's happening and changing so rapidly.
That's kind of my space. So look, there's multiple challenges for let's take an enterprise that takes 300,000 square feet in a building. They want redundant capability. They need to stay productive, so they can't have a single point of entry that then gets cut accidentally by some subcontractor and they're out of business for a week because their internet's down or whatever's down. So they want redundancy, they want security. They want to know that not everybody can go in a telecom closet, take a memory stick and shove it into a server and find out later they were hacked. So there's contingent liability issues. And then there's what is their business? And somebody else said before, if you're building drones and doing virtual reality, you need a bigger pipe. If you're just doing email all day, you need less of a pipe. But so the pain point for the real estate owner is to make sure the tenant can remain focused on their job, stay productive, not lose any business. And the real estate owner wants to know, if they do lose business, is it my fault and will I be sued for it? So we're solving all that by trying to make redundant systems, multiple, separate risers, multiple points of entry. We call them meet me rooms, which is where all the comm service providers come together. Is there a need for 2 of those? So there's redundancy. Most of you that know commercial real estate, there's 3 or 4 manhole covers out front of a building, and they're coming in redundantly from the streets just in case one street fiber gets cut. At least they have fiber on the other side. So all of that is a huge concern and getting to be a larger concern for the more educated real estate owner. Like I said, old real estate owner, I got a 10 by 10 room and it's this much a month. New owner, I got a 10 by 10 room and I want Yelp and Google to rent it, so I got to have technology that stays up all the time. They get what they want. They have all the connectivity they want. So that's the kind of real estate owner we're talking to now, which is a challenge. I mean, think about the things we have to have conversations about. So it's not getting easier. The sales are getting harder, but it's the right thing to do for them because they need to know that if we're going to be there for the long term, they have a partner that kind of is thinking with them through the long term, thinking the business case, and preparing them. I hear a lot of people say future-proofing. I don't know how you future-proof anything. I mean, certainly a robust fiber plant is a start, but the rest of it we may have to rip out. Let's be honest. I mean, so DAS and wireless service provider stuff to me is almost becoming like refresh on Wi-Fi. Most IT shops are refreshing Wi-Fi every 2-3 years, whatever. Yet we go in and say we need a 10-year contract with 2 5 renewals. We need 20 years. Tell that to a guy who thinks technology changes every 3 years. That's not an easy sale. So you have to be there as a partner to help them refresh and think through a business plan, add capital to their budgets, all the things. So it's not the same world.
Well, real estate owners, they historically are not in the telecom space. I mean, that's not their business. So, there needs to be a learning curve and also understand how do you provide them what they need at the least pain threshold possible, right? So, ways to do that is keeping equipment off-site, right? Using base station hotel facilities off of a real estate location, bringing fiber into that building, building a converged network, having multiple services, multiple points of return, right? So that you don't just have a Wi-Fi network or a one wireless carrier only network. Like you have to have all those services, a multi-carrier DAS, plus a Wi-Fi network, plus added small cells and into an environment to support services. There's all different ways that you can provide that, but it's having a converged network and having the wherewithal to provide a service to that enterprise and real estate owner that they historically have not been a party to, and they're learning, but it's not their main focus in their main business.
No, that's absolutely true. Did anybody have anything else to add to that before we move on? I wanted to open up questions to the audience before I got into my last question, which is a little pie in the sky. But did we have any questions from the audience in regards to communications infrastructure? One of the thoughts that I had, sitting here is the internet infrastructure, is getting so big and so robust, and it's being stretched. Research networks use a internet 2 network infrastructure. It's more like a private internet to help, exchange traffic. Is with the growing need for, converged networks and the divergent needs of those converged networks, is that ultimately going to help to have us look at things differently? A huge network for the hyperscalers and the big bandwidth players with a network with not as big pipes, so to speak, with not as much bandwidth for the IoT folks, because you really don't need a big pipe for IoT. You just need to have them proliferated everywhere. And so has that been something that you've all explored in your businesses, looking at different ways to build out different types of network solutions, because not all network needs are equal?
I can address from our sort of simplistic standpoint, which is we have, as our tenants on our towers or our rooftops, IoT companies, cell providers, Wi-Fi companies. I mentioned Dish Networks earlier. They're rolling out an IoT network to start. It's interesting. Well, I also think that, like the internet has done caching for a long time, where they get content closer to the people, right? So edge computing. I think part of what we're seeing is more edge computing, where a lot of the content will be a lot closer to the user, which also may eliminate the need for this huge bandwidth, right? So if a movie's a block away from my house, as opposed to in Santa Barbara, it's going to require a much smaller pipe than it would be if it has to go all that way. So, I think the edge computing is a piece of this we're missing too, that we certainly think about. I'm not really seeing it a whole lot yet, but we're talking about it a lot, and I think we will see it.
Yeah, no, we're seeing it definitely. I'll give you an example of, we do a few, not many. The edge briefing we had just as, before us was interesting. If we have additional space in some of our buildings, we do a thing called like a micro data center, which is let's say you've got a 70-story building, and in today's world, most of the time, the IT guy is taking a piece of his space on the 70th floor and making a little IT shack and putting servers in there and et cetera, et cetera. Well, do they need to do that, or could they put those servers in a mini data center very close? And so, for example, in some of our buildings, we have a mini data center that is just for the tenants in the building. So now it's watched 24/7, 365. There's cameras on it. There's locked space. It's cooled. It's powered all in one room. It doesn't have to be spread out across the building. It saves some space, maybe even saves some IT people. I hate to say that. Maybe put some IT out of work because it's being monitored right from right there in the building. But there's edge, right? And that's, you know, better use of space, better use of dollars, whatever. And they pay a small fee to be in that mini data center. So that's a part of it. On the capacity side, we're just thinking that, look, when we go into a building, I always say this, I only want to do harm to the building once if I can help it. And what I mean by that is we only want to drill holes in walls and shove more fiber in once, because that's the labor, right? It's 65, 80, 70% of our job is the labor to do all that stuff. So let's do that once. Let's put enough fiber and let's whatever, so we don't have to go back. Now, private LTE networks, 3.5, 5G, all that's going to lead to new antennas and new stuff. That's 3.5, yeah. So all of that is going to be asked for because there's going to be use cases that make sense for specific enterprise customers. They don't want to be on the basic internet. They want their own private 3.5 gig using that, if that may be what happens, right? So we got to be ready for that, and we got to have at least the passive infrastructure ready for that from a fiber capability, and out the front door, through the manhole cover, out to these guys' net pops or our net pops or whatever, so that that capability can get there when they ask for it. So that's the way we're thinking about it, is be ready for all asks of capacity level, from the lowest to the highest.
How many real estate owner operators, property managers in here? Do we have any? I know we've got a couple of REITs here at the event as well. You know, you mentioned these, you know, putting in a micro data center in buildings. About 5 years ago, I wrote a piece about data centers, and that's going to be the future. That real estate building owner operators really need to be thinking about how they provide services to their customers, because it's not just about the space anymore. It is about the accessibility to services. You need electricity, plumbing, and network, right? And having all of that in buildings, they have all of these different specialty areas to support that within the infrastructure. And if you take a look at that, you then would also need a micro data center within those buildings to provide services in an aggregate that would be helpful for the tenants in the building. Do you see a lot more of that taking shape? And I'm not going to ask you, Bill, because you just talked about it, but building out fiber and connectivity and bringing Wi-Fi to these types of buildings, are real estate owner operators starting to think in that direction yet? Or is that something we also need to educate more about?
I think it's a process. And I think that there's an edge there that's learning that they need to build intelligently. And it's a very simple concept. Whatever is wireless has to be wired at some point. So if you want to get more services out to the edge, you better run more wired services as far as you can to the edge to provide that. And I concur what Bill was saying in terms of you don't want to have to build that infrastructure twice. You don't want to be running that fiber twice. You want to have as much capacity as you possibly can out to the edge as early as possible, and then build whatever comes next, both in the back end,
Yep.
right? So in your head end location and out to the edge as much as you can. But the pipe in between, you want that as robust as possible in order to make that work. And I think real estate owners and developers are understanding that. But it's a process, and we're not there yet. They're not keenly aware enough yet. However, they're learning, and it's an evolution.
Can I add something real briefly to that? Real estate is flipping so frequently right now that a real estate owner might be super interested in this, but if the building is going to be flipped in 6 months and it's going to take 3 years to build it out, it's a tough sell. And if I was a real estate owner, I'd look at it differently too. So I think that's just a challenge we all need to think about a little bit.
I was just going to add one thing, that a lot of times we have great conversations with the real estate owner, and the real estate owner completely gets it. Then you get to the real estate lawyer. And
Don't stand up.
we realize they are real estate lawyers. They are not telecom lawyers. So sometimes the real education has to be on the real estate lawyers. And if I were inviting to the next Nedas, I would invite real estate lawyers.
Thank you for that.
I would add that your contract's pretty brutal too.
And our contract is brutal too. Yes, it is. Yeah. But the point is it's the understanding of intent. So some things like real estate owners care about is if they sell the building, is the building going to be encumbered, right? So they like having a Starbucks in there because if the next owner doesn't like Starbucks and he likes Seattle's best, he can kick Starbucks out because that contract's termination, right? We put in a couple $1 million of infrastructure. We don't want to be kicked out, so we don't have termination by convenience, right? And a business owner will understand that pretty quickly. A real estate lawyer is going to argue that point. I want to be able to kick you out. And we have a lot of convincing you do, right? So that's the point, is the education piece I can't emphasize on the real estate as a whole. So if you get to your BOMAs or you get to your RealComs or wherever you get to, I think it's really critical for all of us that do this for a living to really keep talking to them about those little clauses that they think are important in their real estate contracts and their leases that don't match with our industry. And we either have to take the risk, which we don't like doing, or they have to take the risk. Okay, another thing to think about, just one more piece on this is, because we were talking data centers, is a lot of times we think about just the capability for the building. One thing I believe is going to happen with 5G, because 5G is about densification, and a TMO or whoever is going to have to get closer to the edge. They're going to want real estate to give space up so they can put in racks, and it may not do a damn thing for that building other than provide income. And what they're doing is they're putting in their TMO stuff in that, and they're going fiber outside to run the outdoor 5G network. And that's another net operating income thing that a real estate owner will like, but does he like that he's encumbering his building with something that doesn't affect his building? So again, that's education, right? And I've had both kind of real estate owners. Real estate owners that goes, I get it, I'll take that risk and go. And I've had other real estate owner that says, anything in my building is for my building only. I won't sign a contract unless. So there's lots to think about.
Any questions? Last chance for questions. All right. Oh, we got one right here. David.
In my telecom career, I've seen some buildings that have always been very open, having diversity, having carriers being very forthcoming. And I've also experienced buildings that see carriers as revenue streams or areas to grow revenue. And how as experts, how do you see that now evolving? Is it still a dichotomy?
Yeah, so the question for those who may be streaming in here is how are the building owner operators, real estate folks looking at the providers? Are they looking at them as a revenue source or as an opportunity to create more revenue?
It all depends on the location.
Yeah, I mean, each building owner is different, but I think when we think about this infrastructure, it's a value add to any building, certainly a value add to a tenant who in this day and age is looking to communicate faster, be connected to more other offices and data centers and what have you. So this is about education. I mean, this is all about educating that this is a tool in the shed for a use case, but it's an important tool. It's a very important tool that is almost becoming a necessity. It's a fact of life. It's just the way we operate and we do business these days.
I mean, if you're a small building and you don't have public traffic, well, then you need to pay for certain infrastructure being there in order to push tenants into your building and to provide those services. If you're a huge public location, then you might have an opportunity to generate some revenue off of the amount of traffic that's through your facility. It all depends on where and when and who's interested in providing what services to that facility, and what's the best interest of you as a landlord to move your business forward.
Yeah, I've been educating for 7 years in this and there's a big transformation in the education of the real estate owner. The real estate owners ask a lot better questions now, and I'll call it, especially in the NFL cities. So anywhere where there is a dense network problem already, the capacity is a challenge for the wireless service providers. Those real estate owners are starting to get it. They're asking the right questions. You know, right now, I would tell you 9 out of 10 meetings when I go to see a real estate owner, they're going to say, well, should I wait for 5G? Yeah. Why would I do this now? Right, so they're hearing what's going on. They're asking the right questions. They're going, well, I heard these guys got this much revenue over here. And I go, well, that was 3 years ago. It ain't going to happen this year. You know, and they have to believe you, right? So the key, I think, you know, my last foot stomp is you have to become a partner with your owners. And that, you know, the one thing Extenet does is, you know, we're not a construction company. We're not. Every indoor network we've built since 2007, we still own and operate today. We are partners with those real estate owners. We've been there that whole time. We don't sell them. We don't do anything. So they know we're going to be there. We commission the networks and we keep them. So that's huge. That's a differentiator, I think, for us. And you're the same way. You build and manage your rooftops and you stay there forever. So they know you're a partner and you're going to help them with the industry as it evolves. If you're not that, if you're a construction company, it's going to be really tough. Yeah. It's really tough.
All right, so Eric, starting with you, 15 seconds or less, 5 years from now, what's your pie-in-the-sky vision?
Pie in the sky vision that mobility will be continue to move out to the edge. So the carriers will start being able to provide through potentially CBRS, as we've seen the evolution of that, a shared network infrastructure that still allows the carriers to manage their networks, unlike a Wi-Fi network where they could share. Carriers don't want to get involved in something like that, but potentially CBRS. With 5G moving to the edge, the carriers are going to have to get closer and closer and closer to the edge, and there's going to be there's less infrastructure to attach to at that edge. So there's a race to the edge, but at some point you got to start sharing some of that infrastructure to make that work. So it's going to be an evolution to the edge.
Enzo?
Well, I mean, I'd like to see a lot of progress in this evolution. Unfortunately, I think we're just in the early innings. In fact, I think we're just right in the coming up with the game and writing the rules. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's got to be a lot of coordination and communication and efforts from all different ends of the spectrum. You know, I said earlier, carriers need to communicate with government needs to communicate with society, and so on and so forth. I'd like to see, you know, us move a bit faster to accomplish those goals, to making a connected world, if you want. But you know, while I want to be optimistic about it, I think we all have a lot of work to do.
So between you and Bill, we're still educating in 5 years.
Tom Brady is retired, and Peyton Manning has moved from commercials to having his own Broadway show.
I think we'll have some new players in the space, new big players. Will be very interesting to see who they are. Is it somebody from Silicon Valley? Who is it? I see some new large players in our space.
There's a lot of changes happening that we have not yet been privy to. I can't even imagine what these big guys are doing out there to enable continued distribution of the content to these smaller devices that are getting more and more powerful. You guys have been great. Thank you so much. Thank you for participating. Thanks for the conversation. Thank you. Yeah. I guess, Steve, you're up.
I am up.